learners, and welcome back to the NPTEL course on Victorian literature. In this and the subsequent lecture, I will discuss the important events, cultural, literary, historical, as well as economic and social, which shaped a very important decade in the Victorian era. That decade is the 1890s. As the two lectures will demonstrate, this is a key decade. It's key because many important changes took place in this time, changes which are essential for us to understand if we are to understand how the Victorian era ended and gradually gave way to the times, the literary cultures, and the events that followed, which is variously known as the 20th century or the modernist era. However, the 1890s are not merely a transitional decade. The changes that took place also help us understand events that occurred in the first 9 decades of the 19th century. The first key difference that we can note in the 1890s is that there is a fundamental shift in the perception of England's place as the imperial leader of the world. There are many other changes which have to do with the changing value of literature in Victorian society. They also have to do with the changing perception of the writer as a professional. They have to do with the changing perception of the popular press, and they have to do with the changing perception of women and women's writing. However, after this summary, it's important to note that these changes and the decade in which these changes can be felt most perceptibly, the 1890s, are important for any student of literature, but they are particularly important and indispensable for a student who seeks to study and understand three key literary texts which are in this course, and they are The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by R.L. Stevenson, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, and Dracula by Bram Stoker. The second and third texts in this trio will be discussed in subsequent lectures in this course. The first, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, will be discovered by my co-instructor, Professor Smita Jha. Now, let us get back to understanding this decade and why it is important. As I mentioned, the first key difference that is felt from the 1890s onwards is a new conception of the value of literature in society. A good way to understand this changed perception is an event that occurred in the year 1897. Now, 1897 is the year of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. That is to say, this was the year Queen Victoria completed 60 years on the throne. She had ascended to the throne in the year 1837, as I mentioned in the very first lecture in this course. So, in her 60th year as queen, a lot of things happened which throw a very important light on what was going on with the Victorian era and how it would soon give way to the modernist era. In the year 1897, Alfred Austin, the then poet laureate, composed a poem celebrating Queen Victoria, a poem that was titled simply Victoria. This poem was not received with any of the excitement or even a fraction of the hope with which its composer had expected that it would be received. So Andrew Sullivan refused to set it to music, and very few reviewers even took the time to say anything about it. And the few who did review it were unified in their indifference to it. Why this lackluster response? What seems to have been the reason? The main reason for this is less the quality of the poem and more a changing perception of the post itself, the post of poet laureate. By 1897, this post had begun to lose almost all of the respect and prestige it had once enjoyed. Here we have a quote from William Dean Howells, which is quoted in the Literary Digest of February the 8th, 1896, shortly after Alfred Austin had taken the position. Howells writes, "The notion of any great man seriously performing the laureate's duties is inextinguishably comic. And the selection of a man who is not great and never can be great has the highest propriety and fitness imaginable as far as these duties are concerned. So the idea is that the position itself is not prestigious. So it would be ridiculous if a great writer were in fact appointed. In fact, it would be proper if a mediocre, middling, and ignorable writer is appointed to this position. Now, to say this is to make a stark contrast between Alfred Austin and the previous poet laureate, who was Alfred Lord Tennyson. In addition to this contrast, there's another contrast which we will use to understand what was going on in the 1890s, and that is a contrast between Alfred Austin's poem Victoria, published in the year 1897, and another poem published in the same year, which is Rudyard Kipling's Recessional. But to return to the question of why Alfred Austin was mocked and considered properly indifferent, it's important to contrast a little bit with what had happened before. Tennyson had served in the same position for 42 years without being mocked at. So while Tennyson was poet laureate, the position was not seen as anything comical. And the reason was that there was a conception of literature as something that had the power to explain society. Readers looked towards the work of great writers in order to understand the world around them. Post 1890s, however, there is a change in the perception. The role that is attributed to writers is less that of an explainer and more that of a recorder. So post 1890s, writers become more chroniclers, are seen more as reporters. And this has to do with the rising popularity of newspapers, magazines, and the popular periodical press in general. Now, when Tennyson died, this change was perceived as a change in the position of the poet laureate. Many people, in fact, felt that the position of poet laureate should be dissolved. And indeed, for 3 years, that post was left vacant, as if society and the administration itself agreed with this idea. And in this phase, when the position lay vacant, William Butler Yeats put it, only an unreadable mediocrity or fluent monger of platitudes was likely to want the job, right? So a lot of writers also began to view this public position not as an honor that could be given to writers, but as a way of diluting the writer's literary powers. And this is exactly what the quotation from William Butler Yeats reflects. And there was also a sense that if there were indeed a writer who was as good as Tennyson and who were a likely candidate for this position, that of poet laureate, the way this writer would express or articulate his or her literary merit would be to reject this position. And indeed, that is exactly what one writer did, which is William Morris, who was offered the position but who unequivocally denied any interest in taking up this position. Now, the story of Alfred Austin and his composition of the poem, his occupation of the position of poet laureate, and generally the lack of respect and prestige he enjoyed, is a kind of narrative which may be called a parable. A parable was a kind of writing which a lot of poets, novelists, historians, and scholars of the time practiced. It's a narrative which can be defined as a synthesis of a complex set of historical, social, and ideological issues into a narrative that invites multiple forms of interpretation. On one side, there is history, and in the case of the Alfred Austin parable, history is writ large in the case of the Jubilee. A grandiose spectacle, that is to say, Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. A grandiose spectacle that's designed to underscore the preeminence of Great Britain and its empire on the world stage. And this was a thing. A lot of writers, observers, and even lay people in the 1890s were quite proud of the dominant status that Great Britain had on the world stage. In the last 2 decades of the century, the empire, that is to say, the British Empire, had become, as never before, a central component of Britain's collective self definition. Right? And there were some reasons for this. In 1897, the British Empire was indeed the largest in the history of the world, the largest single empire the world had ever seen. Victoria ruled 1/4 of the world's population. A staggering fact, and a fact which many newspapers of the time constantly reminded their readers of. These conditions, the fact that there were great historical events and the fact that they were open to interpretation, were exploited by many writers. And some examples of writers using history or collecting historical tales, ancient narratives, in order to make parables of them are J.G. Frazier's The Golden Bough, Andrew Lang's collection of fairy tales, and William Butler Yeats's compilations of Celtic myths and folklore. In addition to these writers, however, who merely collected ancient stories into parables and published them as parables, there were also others who invented new parables, who wrote new stories, created new fictions in the style of parables. Some examples of these: the utopian fictions of Morris and Richard Jefferies, the fairy tales of Oscar Wilde, the Gothic stories of Robert Louis Stevenson and Bram Stoker, the science fiction of H.G. Wells, and several others like these. Even narratives conceived in more traditionally realistic modes, such as Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories, as well as Kipling's stories and novel Kim, as well as Joseph Conrad's Sea Tales, often possess the feel of modern parables or myths. So, this style of thinking about the late Victorian era as a story, it led to a great deal of literary innovation and a great deal of production in many literary genres. However, there was a sense in which these Jubilee celebrations also seemed to exude a sense of a muted sense of despair. And the scholar Herbert Tucker calls this muted sense of despair an autumnal chill. The event served inadvertently to underscore the frailty of the 78-year-old monarch, whose increasing debility could be taken to stand for that of the empire as a whole. So while on one hand it was easy to celebrate many things in the year 1897, celebrate the Queen, celebrate the empire of which the Queen was the monarch, it was also impossible to deny that there was a sense in which both the empire and its monarch were growing increasingly frail. And the monarch was obviously frail because of her age, but also there was a sense in which the empire could be seen as frail. There were feminist, socialist, and anti-racist movements which had begun to articulate their voices by the late 19th century, and these voices would eventually grow stronger and would lead ultimately to the slow but steady disruption and finally the abolition of this great empire. But let us not get ahead of ourselves, and let us think about what were the immediate contexts in which that empire was threatened. Now, 2 years after the Jubilee, as British losses mounted in the Boer War, that is in South Africa, the crisis of public confidence in the imperial idea would deepen. But even in 1897, there were many who saw in jingoistic extravaganzas like the Jubilee a sign of worry, not security. So there were those who felt that the reason why people were celebrating the empire was because there was a reason why it would not last for much longer. Right? In this atmosphere, it is not surprising that the one Jubilee poem to win wide acclaim was Kipling's Recessional. Recessional is a poem that enjoyed a great deal of success. Its reception was markedly different from that of the other poem just mentioned, which is Alfred Austin's poem Victoria. Kipling's poem Recessional was written in a way to mark the Diamond Jubilee, but as its title suggests, is more concerned with endings than beginnings. Recessional has a very melancholic tone and does not allow for a simple minded celebration of empire. In fact, it makes the celebration of empire more valuable precisely because it is aware that there is something which is going to end. So even while empire must be celebrated, it is celebrated because there is something about it which will ensure its own demise. The poem's austerely elegiac tone captures Kipling's firm commitment to the ideology of empire, but also his deep sense of historical belatedness. Historical belatedness came from the sense that Kipling knew that while all this was good, it was certainly very important and very pleasurable for many citizens of Great Britain that England had these deep material resources and could enjoy a great deal of material comfort. There was also a sense, however, that these things, that the days were numbered for this kind of enjoyment. Right? And this is the complex sense that Kipling conveys in the poem Recessional. Now, to return to the parable, the magazine named Punch described the story of Alfred Austin writing a poem for Queen Victoria and contrasted it to the career of the previous poet laureate, Alfred Lord Tennyson, by comparing these two as Alfred the Great and Alfred the Little. Alfred the Great referred to Tennyson, of course, and Alfred the Little referred to Austen. Now, the sense in this kind of a parable was that the heirs of the great writers of the Victorian era were themselves far from great. That is, the Victorian era had witnessed some truly great writers, but the writers that were in action in the current decade, that is, in the 1890s, were not great at all. In fact, they were quite ridiculous. Hence, in the place of Alfred the Great, who once was, we now have Alfred the Little. Now, there was some truth to this kind of a narrative. In the 1880s and 1890s, many of the great Victorian writers, the writers who had enjoyed a prestigious reputation as sages, many of them had died. Precisely who had died? The list is long, even though not exhaustive. George Eliot passed away in 1880, Thomas Carlyle in 1881, Dante Gabriel Rossetti in 1882, Anthony Trollope in 1882, Matthew Arnold in the year 1888, Wilkie Collins in the year 1889, Robert Browning in the year 1889, Christina Rossetti in the year 1894, and finally Walter Pater in the year 1894. So as we can see from this list, the who's who of Victorian literature disappeared in the span of a few years. It is this gap that the Punch magazine is talking about by contrasting Alfred the Great with Alfred the Little. So that helps us understand how in the 1890s, the value of literature had undergone a profound transformation. Literature was no longer something that explained the world, it was something that merely reflected the world. The sense of mere reflection can be seen in the rise of journalism, newspapers, and popular publishing. The second half of the 19th century had witnessed a dramatic and exponential rise in the periodical press. And a sense of this can be had from just looking at the numbers. While in the year 1860, there were only 31 daily newspapers in Britain, in the span of 30 years, by 1890, there were 150, of which more than a dozen were based out of London. So these numbers give us a sense of the exponential rise of reading, but also an exponential rise of a particular kind of reading. Not a serious intellectual reading, but something that passes the time, something that is topical, something that is easy, and something that provides a great deal of short-term entertainment with low stakes and which keeps a lot of people engaged when they have time to pass. Right? Now, why or how was there such a radical increase in the popularity of the printing press? There were some material causes for this. Right? The material changes that produced this explosion of journalism, most notable of which was the repeal of tax and paper duties in the 1850s and the steady fall of newsprint prices, which itself resulted largely from the change from cotton rags to esparto, and then to wood pulp in the making of paper. And finally, the invention of the web rotary press and of mechanical typesetting machines. So there were some material reasons why journalism, popular writing, and newspaper publishing exploded in the second half of the 19th century and really reached a high point in the 1890s. The high point was from the perspective of editors and proprietors of these magazines. From the perspective of intellectuals and more serious Victorian writers, however, there was nothing to be happy about it, and in fact, the high point of the 1890s, as the peak of Victorian journalism, was a sort of low point in the intellectual life of the nation. And it's important to note that in the literary history of the Victorian era, the 1890s is a time which is marked by vitriolic denunciations of the press. These denunciations became an important part of the literary discourse of their time. One example of this is Arthur Symons, who writes in the year 1903, and I quote, "The newspaper is the plague or black death of the modern world," unquote. This opinion of the serious writer about how popular journalism and writing was destroying the intellectual life of the nation can be seen by a contrast between the views of Matthew Arnold and W.T. Stead. In May of 1887, in an essay published in the journal The 19th Century, Matthew Arnold argued that what he termed the new journalism was the voice of the new voters, the democracy, as people are fond of calling it, who had been enfranchised by the reform bills of 1867 and 1884. So you can see, if you've been tracking the number of times I've mentioned the word reform bill in this course, that there is a steady movement in the social hierarchy from monarchy to republicanism, which is reflected in the passage of successive reform bills. The first wave was in the 1830s, the second wave was in the 1860s, and these reform bills democratize the politics of the nation by ensuring that newer and more wider groups of people have the right to vote. From the perspective of literature and literary history, however, this democratization is seen as a bad thing, as we see in this comment by Matthew Arnold, who feels that the demands that these wider communities of voters place on the production of literature leads to the dilution and the erosion of literary values. As more and more people get educated and become empowered to vote and to purchase books, and therefore to have a say in what they want to read and what should be written, the literary values are diluted. Now, as against Matthew Arnold, we can contrast the views of W.T. Stead, who was the editor of a magazine, of a newspaper named the Pall Mall Gazette. Now, the Pall Mall Gazette and the Daily Mail would later become the most well-known and actually the most popular newspapers and tabloids as they are known today. But they had their origin in the late 19th century, and their reputation was considered highly suspicious by intellectuals like Matthew Arnold, but who played a very important role in social change, and they cannot be entirely dismissed as sensational or non-serious. Although some of the implications of the kind of writing they published were quite detrimental to society at large. We will continue to focus on the other social developments of the 1890s, including the implications of the new journalism, as well as the change in the perception of women's writing, feminism, and socialism in the next lecture. Thank you.